third house on Pemberton Lane had its cans out on Wednesday like every other house. 2 green bins, 1 blue recycling tote, yard waste in a paper bag. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of thing you'd never look at twice. But Darren Lott looked at it twice, because the route sheet said Pemberton Lane wasn't on Wednesdays. Pemberton Lane was a Monday street, had been a Monday street for 11 years. And today was Wednesday, October 15th, and every single house on the lane had its cans at the curb like they'd been told to, like it was perfectly routine, like Monday had quietly become Wednesday and nobody had sent a memo except to the residents. He looked at Marcus in the driver's seat. Marcus hadn't slowed down. "We doing Pemberton?" Darren asked. "It's on the sheet. Since when?" Marcus glanced at the route sheet clipped above the dash, looked at the street sign, looked back at the sheet. His jaw did something. Not quite a clench, more like he was pressing his tongue against his teeth to keep a word from getting out. Then he pulled the truck forward and the compactor whined to life, and they started working the street. That was Darren's 9th day on the job. He hadn't wanted the job. Nobody wants to be a garbage man, and anyone who says otherwise is either lying or trying to sell you something about the dignity of labor. Darren had wanted to be an HVAC technician. He'd done 2 semesters of trade school in San Bernardino before his mother got sick, and the money situation turned into the no-money situation, and he moved back to Hessler, California, a town 40 minutes east of Sacramento that had a Dollar General, a gas station with a Subway inside, and about 9,000 people who all seemed to know each other from church or high school or both. The garbage job was through Consolidated Waste Services, a regional contractor that handled residential pickup for Hessler and 5 surrounding towns. The pay was $19.50 an hour, which was better than the Dollar General. The hours were 5 a.m. to 1:30 p.m., which meant the afternoons were free. The interview lasted 4 minutes and consisted mostly of a woman named Pam asking if he had a valid driver's license and whether he could lift 60 pounds repeatedly. He said yes to both, and Pam slid a single laminated sheet across the desk. "Read this before your first day," she said. "Don't lose it. We don't reprint them." It was the rules. There were 6. They were typed in a plain font on a white card, laminated in thick plastic that had yellowed slightly at the edges. No header, no logo, no Consolidated Waste Services branding. Just the rules, numbered, with a thin black border. 1. Do not open any container that is sealed with red tape or red binding of any kind. Place it in the truck as is. 2. If a residence has placed items at the curb on a day that is not their scheduled pickup day, collect the items anyway. Do not flag it. Do not report it. 3. Do not speak to homeowners who are watching from inside their homes. If a homeowner comes outside, you may respond only to direct questions. Do not initiate. 4. If you find a container that is unusually heavy, heavier than its size should allow, do not attempt to lift it manually. Use the truck's automated arm. If the arm fails, leave the container and proceed to the next address. Mark the address on your sheet with a single dot. 5. Between the hours of 11 a.m. and 11:40 a.m., do not empty any container on a street where you are the only vehicle visible. Wait until another vehicle passes, then proceed. The first week was physical and boring in equal measure. Darren's hands blistered by Tuesday. His lower back seized on Thursday. The smell was constant. Not the cartoon stink of rotten eggs, but a deeper, wetter, more biological smell. The smell of organic matter losing its identity, becoming just material. He wore gloves. He wore boots. He learned the rhythm. Marcus drove. Darren and Tomas worked the curb, one on each side when the street was wide enough, both on the right when it wasn't. The route covered roughly 11,900 homes across 6 neighborhoods. Each neighborhood a designated pickup day. Maple Terrace was Monday. Cedar Hills was Monday. Pemberton Lane was Monday. Pemberton Lane was Monday. Orchard Park was Tuesday. The Flats, a long stretch of older ranch houses south of the railroad tracks, was Wednesday. Riverside and the commercial strip were Thursday. Friday was overflow and special pickups. It was predictable. It was mechanical. And for the first 4 days, none of the rules came up. Darren almost forgot about them. On Friday, his 5th day, they were working a special pickup on Danforth Road, a semi-rural stretch outside the main grid, where houses sat on half-acre lots behind chain-link fences. Most of the pickups out here were bulky items, old couches, broken appliances, mattresses that had been rained on and dried and rained on again until they looked like geological formations. Tomas was pulling a rolled carpet to the truck when he stopped. Hey, red tape. Darren walked over. Next to the carpet there was a black garbage bag, a standard 55-gallon contractor bag, and around its neck, wound 3 times, and knotted, was a strip of red tape. Not duct tape, not electrical tape. It was a flat, matte finish red tape, maybe an inch wide, the kind you might see on a hazmat boundary or crime scene perimeter, except it had no writing on it, just red. The bag wasn't large, maybe the size of a basketball inside. Darren reached for it. Rule 1, Tomas said. I wasn't going to open it. I was going to put it in the truck. That's what the rule says. Put it in the truck as is. So they did. Tomas lifted it with one hand. It wasn't heavy, and tossed it into the hopper. The compactor cycled. The bag disappeared into the body of the truck with everything else. Darren stood there for a second, looking at where the bag had been. Do you know what's in those? He asked. Tomas had already moved on to the next house. Over his shoulder, without turning, Nope. You're not curious? I'm not paid to be curious. I'm not paid to be curious. Neither are you. That was fair. That was reasonable. That was the kind of thing a practical person says when they've got a job that pays $19.50 an hour and they'd like to keep it. Darren understood that. He told himself he understood that. He went back to work. But here's the thing about the red tape bag. The thing that nagged at him through the weekend and was still nagging at him when he showed up Monday morning for week 2, it wasn't the bag itself, it was Tomas. Tomas had been working this route for 4 years. 4 years of picking up garbage, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year. He'd seen hundreds of those bags, maybe thousands. And his reaction wasn't the reaction of a man who was used to something. It was the reaction of a man who had decided to be used to something. There's a difference. A person who's genuinely unbothered doesn't preemptively cite the rule number, they just do the thing. Tomas had said, Rule 1, before Darren had even touched the bag, like he'd been watching for the moment, like part of his job, maybe the actual core of his job, was making sure the new guy didn't deviate. Darren filed that thought away. He didn't bring it up again, week 2. Monday, the route started normal. Maple Terrace, Cedar Hills, Pemberton Lane. The sky was flat and gray and the streets were quiet the way suburban streets are quiet at 6 in the morning. Not silent, but muted, like the neighborhood was breathing slowly. On Cedar Hills, they hit their first Rule 3 situation. Darren was hauling a recycling bin to the truck when he noticed movement in the front window of number 44112. A woman standing just inside the glass, watching. Not peeking through blinds, not casually glancing. Standing squarely in the window, both hands at her sides, looking directly at him. He almost waved. It was instinct. You see someone looking at you, you wave, you nod, you acknowledge the mutual human presence. He caught himself, because Rule 3 had surfaced in his memory unbidden, like his brain had been keeping it loaded and ready. Do not speak to homeowners who are watching from inside their homes. The woman didn't move. Darren went back to the bin. He rolled it to the truck. Tomas lifted the automated arm. The bin tipped into the hopper. The compactor ran. The whole process took maybe 45 seconds. The entire time, Darren could feel the woman watching him, not watching the truck, not watching the process, watching him. When the bin was back at the curb and the truck pulled forward, Darren glanced at the window again. She was still there, same position, same posture, same direct, unlocked gaze. Does that happen a lot? Darren asked Marcus through the cab window. Does what happen a lot? People watching like that, standing in the window. Marcus checked his mirror, adjusted the route sheet. People watch all kinds of things. Don't worry about it. Rule 3 says, I know what Rule 3 says. The truck moved on. Darren worked the next house. And the next. And the next. And at 4418 Cedar Hills, there was another person in the window. A man this time, same posture. Hands at his sides, looking directly at the truck. And at 4424, another woman. And at 4430, a teenager, maybe 16, still in pajamas. All standing, all watching, all with that same quality of attention. Not curious, not hostile, not neighborly. Something else. Something Darren didn't have a word for yet. Marcus, Darren said very calmly. Every house on this block has someone in the window. Yep, that's not normal. It's Cedar Hills, Marcus said. Cedar Hills watches. And then he pulled onto the next street, and the windows were empty, and the morning went on. That night in his apartment, a one-bedroom unit above a woman named Gloria who watched Wheel of Fortune at maximum volume, Darren sat on his bed with a laminated card and read the rules again, all 6, slowly, and for the first time he noticed something about the way they were written. Not the content, the structure. Rules 1 through 3 were about things. Containers, items, people, tangible nouns with physical presence. Do this with this thing. Don't do this with this person. Rules 4 through 6 were different. They were about conditions. Unusually heavy, the only vehicle visible. A container that wasn't there before. These weren't rules about objects. They were rules about states of reality. They were telling you, if the world is like this, do that. As if the world being like this was a known, anticipated, regularly occurring phenomenon. The rules weren't protective measures against unusual events. They were operational guidelines for a world where unusual events were the baseline. Darren put the card on his nightstand. He stared at the ceiling. Gloria's TV bled through the floor. The sound of the wheels spinning, the audience clapping, a contestant asking to buy a vowel. He fell asleep with the light on. Day 10, Wednesday. The flats. The flats was Darren's least favorite part of the route. The houses were older, the lots were bigger, and the space between homes meant more walking. The bins were often heavier. People out here had workshops, garages full of projects, old machinery they were slowly disassembling into the waste stream. Darren's arms burned by the third block. At 10:47 a.m., Tomas flagged a bin at 1150 South Harmon. Heavy one. Darren grabbed the handle and pulled. The bin didn't move. Not in the way a heavy bin doesn't move. Not resistance, not weight stubbornly gripping the ground. It didn't move the way a fire hydrant doesn't move. The way a telephone pole doesn't move. The bin was a 96-gallon toter, standard issue, green with a black lid. It should have weighed, fully loaded, maybe 120 pounds at most. Darren had moved hundreds of them. He knew the feel, the physics, the tipping point. This one was rooted. This one felt like it went down, down through the plastic bottom, and into the concrete, and through the concrete, into the earth itself. Arm, Tomas said. Marcus positioned the truck. The automated arm extended, gripped the bin, and lifted. The arm is rated for 300 pounds. It's a hydraulic system attached to a commercial truck chassis. It does not struggle. It struggle. The arm whined. The hydraulic pitch changed higher, thinner, the sound of a system being asked to exceed its design parameters. The bin tilted maybe 5 degrees, then 10. The arm shook. The truck actually shifted on its suspension, the cab dipping slightly toward the curb, and then the arm failed. Not broke, the safety cutoff engaged. The system detected an overload condition and retracted. The bin settled back to vertical with a sound that was less of a thud and more of a low, resonant thum that Darren felt in his molars. Rule 4. If the arm fails, leave the container and proceed to the next address. Mark the address with a single dot. Marcus put a dot on the route sheet next to 1150 South Harmon. Tomas was already walking to the next house. Darren stood on the curb looking at the bin. It was a normal bin. Green. Black lid. Standard size. There was no visible reason for it to weigh what it weighed. There was no visible reason for anything that had just happened. Darren. Marcus's voice from the cab, not sharp. Patient. Next house. Darren went to the next house, but he looked back once, and later he would try to convince himself he hadn't seen what he saw, which was, the bin was in a different position. Not dramatically. Not across the yard different. But the angle had changed. It had been parallel to the curb when they'd tried to lift it. Now it was turned maybe 15 degrees, as if it had pivoted slightly on its base, as if it had watched the truck leave and then relaxed. At 11 a.m., the truck stopped, not because Marcus hit the brakes, because it was 11 a.m. and Rule 5 was active, and they were on South Harmon, a long straight road with no cross streets for a quarter mile in either direction, and there were no other vehicles in sight. Break time, Marcus said. He turned off the engine. Darren and Tomas sat on the rear step of the truck. Tomas opened a thermos of coffee. Marcus stayed in the cab with the window down. The street was empty. The sky was the same flat gray it had been all week. The houses sat in their lots, quiet and ordinary. Trash cans and recycling bins lining the curbs like sentries. "So, we just wait," Darren said. "We wait," Tomas confirmed, "for any car. Any vehicle. Any vehicle. And if nobody comes, somebody always comes. Might take 10 minutes, might take 30. Somebody always comes." Darren looked down the street. Both directions. Nothing. No movement. Not even a dog. "Why?" he asked. Tomas drank his coffee. "Tomas, why can't we be the only vehicle on the street? Because the rules say we can't." "That's not a reason." Tomas lowered his thermos. He looked at Darren and his expression was complicated. It wasn't the blank wall of a man who didn't know. It wasn't the guarded face of a man who wouldn't say. It was the expression of a man who had once asked the same question, and the answer he'd arrived at was one he genuinely did not want to share, because sharing it would make it more real. "You ever notice," Tomas said slowly, "that when you're the only car on a road, the road feels longer?" Darren waited, like the road itself knows it's just you. And I don't know how to put this. It relaxes, spreads out. The houses get a little farther apart. The numbers don't quite track. You'll pass 1150 and the next house should be 1152, but it's 1158 and you think, okay, maybe there's an empty lot, but you look back and there isn't. The road just stretched. He took another sip of coffee. Other cars keep it honest. Other cars are witnesses. The road behaves when it's being watched. Marcus said nothing from the cab. Didn't confirm. Didn't deny. Stared straight ahead through the windshield at the empty street. At 11:23 a.m., a silver Honda Civic turned onto South Harmon from a cross street that Darren had not previously noticed. It drove past them at exactly the speed limit, and the driver, an older man in a baseball cap, did not look at the truck. Marcus started the engine. They went back to work. Here's the thing Darren couldn't stop thinking about that night, and the next night, and the night after that. Tomas hadn't said it like a ghost story. He hadn't said it like a theory, or a suspicion, or a piece of break room lore. He'd said it the way you'd describe a road hazard. Watch out for the pothole on 5th. The lighted Oaken Main runs long. South Harmon stretches when it's empty. A fact of the infrastructure. A known condition. Maintained not through secrecy, but through procedural management. The rules weren't hiding anything. The rules were load-bearing. They were the mechanism by which an abnormal reality was kept within functional parameters. Remove the rules, and you didn't expose a conspiracy. You lost containment. That realization should have made Darren feel better. It didn't. Because if the rules were containment, then Consolidated Waste Services wasn't a garbage company. It was a maintenance operation. And the garbage, the actual household waste, the diapers and takeout containers and lawn clippings, that was incidental. That was cover. The real job was something else. The real job was keeping the route. Day 14, Thursday, Riverside in the commercial strip. This was the easiest part of the week. The commercial strip was a half-mile stretch of small businesses, a laundromat, a taqueria, an auto parts store, a barber shop, and the bins were standard commercial dumpsters serviced by the truck's front load forks. Marcus did most of it from the cab. Darren and Thomas handled the few residential blocks of Riverside, which were small, tidy houses with tidy yards and residents who kept their bins clean and organized. Rule 6 happened on Riverside. They'd done the north side of the street, then U-turned and started back on the south. Darren was working 307 Riverside, a yellow bungalow with a chain-link fence and a ceramic frog by the front step, when he looked ahead to the next house, 309, and saw a bin at the curb. This was unremarkable except for one thing. Darren had looked at 309 on the first pass, the north side pass, less than 10 minutes ago. He'd looked right at it, and there had been no bin. The bin was there now. Green, black lid, positioned neatly at the curb, as if it had always been there. Rule 6. If you see a container at the curb that you did not see on your previous pass of the same street, do not collect it. Do not touch it. Continue your route. Darren continued his route. He did not collect it. He did not touch it. He walked past 309 Riverside and went to Layer 11 and pulled their bin to the truck, and the compactor ran, and the morning continued. But he watched the bin at 309 as the truck pulled away. He watched it in the side mirror, getting smaller, sitting at the curb of a yellow adjacent bungalow on a quiet street in the gray October light. And as the truck turned the corner, just before 309 left his sightline, the bin's lid opened, slowly, maybe 2 inches, as if something inside was checking whether the truck had really gone. And then they were around the corner and it was out of view. Darren didn't mention it to Thomas. He didn't mention it to Marcus. He went home that afternoon and sat on his bed and held the laminated card and read Rule 6 4 more times and thought, the rule doesn't say what happens if you collect it. The rule just says, don't, which means someone, at some point, collected one. And whatever happened was bad enough to make a rule, but not bad enough to explain why. The absence of an explanation was worse than any explanation would have been. Week 3 began with rain. Not heavy rain, a persistent, fine mist that turned everything gray-green and made the bins slippery and the streets reflective. Monday's route went normally. Maple Terrace, Cedar Hills, Pemberton Lane. The watchers were in the windows on Cedar Hills. Darren didn't look. Thomas didn't look. Marcus drove. Tuesday, Orchard Park. Something changed. Orchard Park was a newer development. Houses built in the mid-2000s, vinyl siding, 2-car garages, streets named after trees that didn't grow in Central California. Elm Court, Birch Lane, Sequoia Drive. The bins were always out, the recycling was always sorted, and the residents were the kind of people who believed in HOAs and wrote emails to the city council about streetlight timings. At 8:15 a.m. on Elm Court, Darren found the second red tape bag of his employment. This one was different from the first. The first had been small, basketball-sized. This one was a full 55-gallon bag. Heavy, cinched at the top with red tape wound so many times it formed a thick collar of red around the bag's neck. The tape was wet from the mist, and in the gray light, the red looked darker than it should have. Not bright red, not fire engine red. A deeper, older, more organic red. The bag was sitting next to the regular bins at 4007 Elm Court. The house was beige. The garage was closed. The lawn was mowed. There was a plastic tricycle on the porch. Darren picked up the bag. It was heavy, maybe 40 pounds, and the weight shifted when he lifted it. Not sloshing, not rattling. A slow, dense redistribution like wet clay moving inside a mold. He carried it to the truck. He placed it in the hopper. The compactor cycled. As the compactor's plate compressed, Darren heard something from inside the body of the truck. Not from the bag, from the mass of compressed waste the bag had joined. A sound. Low, brief, like a hum, like the resonant vibration of a struck bell, except felt more than heard, experienced in the chest and the joints rather than the ears. Then it was gone. The compactor finished its cycle. The truck was just a truck. Thomas was at the next house. Marcus was checking the route sheet. Nobody had reacted to the sound. Not because they hadn't heard it, because they had, and had decided long ago to file it under the category of things the job includes. That afternoon, off the clock, Darren drove his own car back to Elm Court. He didn't know exactly what he intended. Some loose idea about knocking on the door at 4217 and asking, "What? What was in the bag? Why the red tape? Are you aware that your garbage hums?" He didn't go to 4007. He didn't go because when he turned onto Elm Court, every house had a red tape bag at the curb. Every single one. Both sides of the street. Identical black bags. Identical red tape collars, arranged next to the regular bins as if a memo had gone out, as if this was scheduled, expected routine. Pickup had been that morning. These bags had not been there that morning. Darren had worked this street personally, house by house. He had seen one red tape bag. At 407, just the one. Now there were, he counted, 31. He drove slowly. The mist had stopped, but the sky was still low and gray. The bags sat at the curbs, patient, like they were waiting for a truck that hadn't come yet, waiting for a pickup that was outside the normal schedule, a second collection. Darren pulled over. He got out of the car. He walked toward the nearest bag, 4201 Elm Court, the first house on the street. The bag was the same as the one from 4207. Same size, same tape. He stood over it. He could feel something. Not a sound, not a vibration. A pull, a slight gravitational tug on his attention, as if the bag was a little more real than the air around it, a little more present, a little more here. He did not touch it. Rule 1 was in his head, clear as a bell: do not open any container sealed with red tape. But Rule 1 was a work rule. He was off the clock. He was in his own car. He was a private citizen standing on a public sidewalk. He reached for the tape. Behind him, a car horn beeped, short, polite, not aggressive. The kind of horn tap someone gives when a light turns green and you haven't noticed. Darren turned. A white consolidated waste pickup truck, not a garbage truck, a regular Ford F-150 with the consolidated logo on the door, was parked across the street. The driver was a woman Darren had never seen. She was looking at him through the windshield. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't frowning. She had the same expression Pam had given him in the office, the Riverstone expression, smoothed by repetition. She shook her head. Once, side to side, slow. Then she drove away. Darren got in his car and drove home. By the time he reached his apartment, his hands had stopped shaking. He told himself it was the cold. He almost quit that night. He sat at his kitchen table with his phone open to the Indeed app and scrolled through listings. Warehouse associate, $17/hour. Pizza delivery, tips plus mileage. Landscaping crew, seasonal, no experience required. Normal jobs. Jobs where the garbage didn't hum and the roads didn't stretch, and nobody stood in windows watching you with their arms at their sides like mannequins in a department store that had been closed for years. He didn't quit. He didn't quit because of the money. $19.50 was the best he'd find without a certification. And he didn't quit because quitting would mean explaining to his mother, who was recovering from surgery and living on disability and counting on his share of the rent, that he'd left a steady paycheck because the garbage was weird. He also didn't quit because of something else. Something he didn't fully admit to himself yet, but which was there, operating beneath the surface of his practical reasoning like a current beneath still water. He wanted to see the route sheet, not the daily sheet Marcus kept on the dash, the master sheet. The one that would show all the routes, all the neighborhoods, the full picture of what Consolidated Waste Services actually covered, and how the schedule actually worked. Because Darren had started keeping track, mentally, of the small inconsistencies. Pemberton Lane appearing on Wednesday, the house numbers that didn't quite sequence, the way certain streets seemed to have more houses on them than the last time he'd driven them, and he suspected that if he saw the full map, those inconsistencies would resolve into something. A pattern. A shape. A reason. He didn't know yet that the shape was the reason he shouldn't look. Week 3, Wednesday. Day 17. The flats again. Darren had been dreading this, South Harmon the heavy bin, the 11 a.m. dead zone. But the morning was mild, and the route was smooth, and the bins were normal weight, and at 10:50 a.m. they finished the last house before the Rule 5 window, and Marcus pulled the truck to the side, and they sat and waited. At 10,055, Darren said, "Can I see the master route?" Marcus's hands were on the steering wheel. He didn't move. The full schedule, all the neighborhoods, all the days. "I want to see how the whole thing maps out." "Why?" "Because Pemberton showed up on Wednesday 2 weeks ago, and it's supposed to be Monday, and I want to know if there are other streets that move around." Marcus turned his head. He looked at Darren directly, which he rarely did. Marcus was a mirror and windshield guy, a man who related to the world through reflections and glass, who drove all day and interacted with reality at one remove. Looking at Darren directly was, for Marcus, an act of unusual engagement. "Streets don't move," Marcus said. "Pemberton did. Pemberton was always Wednesday." "Marcus, I worked Pemberton on Monday, my first week. I remember it specifically because there was a house with a wooden pelican by the mailbox, and I thought Pemberton is a Wednesday street. It's always been a Wednesday street." "Check the sheet." Darren looked at the route sheet clipped to the dash. Pemberton Lane was listed under Wednesday. The ink looked no different from any other entry. There was no correction, no whiteout, no sign of alteration. But Darren remembered Monday. He remembered the pelican. "Look," Marcus said, and his voice had changed. It was lower, more careful, the voice of a man choosing his words the way you choose your steps, in an unfamiliar building in the dark. "The route sheet is the truth. Whatever you remember, the sheet is what's real. That's not a suggestion. That's how it works here. The sheet keeps it organized. If you start going by memory instead of the sheet, things get confused. And when things get confused out here, the route gets difficult." "Difficult how?" "Longer." The word sat between them. Longer. Not harder. Not more dangerous. Longer. As if the route was a living measurement that could be affected by the state of mind of the people driving it. As if belief and geography were, in Hessler, entangled. At 11:02, a FedEx van drove past. Marcus started the engine. They went back to work. Darren didn't ask about the master route again. But that night, he drove to the Consolidated Waste Building. It was after hours, 7 p.m., full dark, the parking lot lit by 2 sodium lights that turned everything the color of old teeth. The building was a single-story cinder-block rectangle with a corrugated metal roof, the kind of structure that could be a plumbing supply warehouse, or a motor pool, or a dog kennel. The front door was locked. The windows were dark. Darren walked around to the back. The truck yard was fenced with chain link, and through it he could see the fleet: 6 residential trucks, 2 front loaders for commercial, 3 pickup trucks, and, parked in the far corner, facing the fence, away from the lights, a vehicle he hadn't seen before. It was a tanker truck, a proper tanker, the kind used for liquid transport, fuel oil, water, milk. Cylindrical tank on a flatbed chassis, maybe 4,000 gallons. It was painted the same white as the rest of the fleet, but it had no Consolidated logo, no markings at all, just white, and it was warm. Darren could feel it from 20 feet away, through the chain-link fence. Not heat, not temperature. A warmth in the attention, a slight thickening of the air around it. The same not-quite gravitational pull he'd felt from the red tape bag on Elm Court. The tanker was present the way the bags were present. More here than the things around it. The tank had a valve at the rear, standard ball valve, industrial grade, and from the valve, dripping at a rate of maybe once every 3 seconds, a dark liquid was falling into a steel drip pan on the ground. Darren watched 5 drops fall. Each one caught the sodium light for an instant as it descended, thick, dark, not quite black, with a faint iridescence that shifted from green to purple to something his eyes refused to name. The 6th drop didn't fall. It hung from the valve, elongating, stretching downward, and then, without detaching, it reached back up, like a finger retracting, like a thread being reeled in. The drop pulled itself back into the valve, and the dripping stopped, and the tanker was just a tanker, white and silent in the yellow light. Darren drove home. He did not sleep. At 4:45 a.m., he was in the parking lot in the dark, and when Marcus and Thomas arrived, he said good morning, and they said good morning, and they climbed into Unit 09 and started the route. He did not mention the tanker. Week 4, the last week of October. The light was different now. Autumn had arrived in that specific Central California way, not the dramatic foliage change of the Northeast, but a subtle draining, a reduction in the saturation of everything, as if the world was being photocopied and each day was one generation further from the original. Monday through Wednesday were normal, or rather, they were consistent with the new normal. Darren had reluctantly accepted bins that were too heavy, windows full of watchers, red tape bags that appeared with increasing frequency, the 11 a.m. dead zone on the flats. He followed the rules. He did his job. He went home. Thursday, Riverside again, was when the rules stopped being enough. It started with the route sheet. Marcus pulled it from the visor clip at the start of the shift, and Darren saw it from the passenger seat and felt something cold move through his chest. The sheet listed the usual Riverside addresses, the usual order, the usual stops. But at the bottom, below the last address, there was a new entry, written in the same typeface as the rest, printed, not handwritten, as if it had always been there. Route extension, Sycamore Circle. Collect all containers. No rule apply. Darren read it 3 times. No rules apply. Marcus. What's Sycamore Circle? Marcus looked at the entry. His face did something Darren had never seen from him before. It went blank. Not the careful blankness of a man hiding a reaction. The genuine blankness of a man who has no reaction to access. A null expression. As if the part of his brain responsible for processing this information had simply declined to engage. Must be new, Marcus said. Must be. Marcus, there's no Sycamore Circle in Hessler. I've been on every street in this town. There's no, if it's on the sheet, it's on the route. If it's on the route, we drive it. And the no rules apply part, then no rules apply. Marcus put the truck in gear. They drove. They did the regular Riverside route first. Everything normal. Everything in its place. Bins out, bins emptied, compactor running, the mechanical rhythm of the job. It took 3 hours. At 9:30 a.m., with Riverside complete, Marcus turned the truck south, away from the commercial strip toward a part of town Darren knew, or thought he knew, was empty land, a drainage easement, and then open fields stretching toward the railroad tracks. Except there was a street. It came off the main road at a gentle angle, newly paved. The asphalt was so dark it looked wet, with a single green street sign at the corner, Sycamore Circle. The street curved to the right, in a gradual arc, and along its outer edge were houses, 10 of them, maybe 12. It was hard to count because the street's curve made it impossible to see them all at once. There were always 1 or 2 just beyond the bend, suggested but not confirmed. The houses were normal, ranch-style, single-story, the same vintage and style as the rest of Hessler. Beige and green and pale blue. Garages and driveways and mailboxes and ceramic decorations and recycling bins and garbage cans at the curb. But there were no cars in the driveways, no lights in the windows, no lawn furniture, no hoses, no bikes, no shoes. By the front door, no wind chimes, no bird feeders, no evidence of habitation whatsoever. The houses were perfect and empty. Model homes, display units, architectural suggestions of domesticity with nothing domestic inside them, and the bins were at the curb, every house. Green bins, blue bins, yard waste bags. Waiting. Marcus stopped the truck at the first house. Darren and Tomas got out. Darren looked at Tomas. Tomas was staring at the houses with an expression Darren recognized, because it was the expression he'd been wearing himself for 2 weeks. The face of a man who is seeing something wrong and is running through his entire inventory of explanations and finding every shelf empty. "This street wasn't here yesterday," Tomas said. "I know. I've driven past this intersection every week for 4 years. This street was not here. I know, and the sheet says no rules apply. I know. They looked at each other. They looked at the bins. Darren walked to the first one. One Sycamore Circle, a beige house with brown trim and a concrete bird bath in the front yard. Dry, no water, no bird. And he grabbed the bin and tipped it toward the truck. The bin was normal weight, maybe 30 pounds. He swung it up and the contents tumbled into the hopper, standard household waste. A cereal box, coffee grounds, a crumpled paper towel, junk mail, a banana peel, the most ordinary garbage he'd ever seen. He did the next house. Same thing. And the next. Normal garbage. Normal weight. Normal bins. No red tape. No impossible heaviness. No humming. Just trash. By the fifth house, Darren had almost relaxed. Almost decided that Sycamore Circle was just a new development, that the lack of residents meant the contractors were still staging, that the garbage was left over from the construction crew's lunches, that everything was fine. Then he opened the bin at 6 Sycamore Circle. It was empty, completely empty, clean, but on the inside of the lid, written in black marker and small, neat handwriting, were 4 words: Darren, check your road. He stared at it. The handwriting was precise but not mechanical. Human. Someone had written his name on the inside of a garbage bin lid on a street that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. He didn't call out to Marcus or Tomas. He closed the lid. He moved the bin to the curb. He went to House 7. House 7's bin was also empty. Inside the lid, they adjusted every quarter House 8. The red bags are not waste House 9. The tanker goes to Mill Creek House 10. You will ready now, but you don't now, but you don't now, you House. What you don't now, you House 11. Check what happened to Road, River 6, House 12. The last house on the circle, just at the point where the curve completed and the street would logically loop back to the main road, had no bin at all. No bin, no recycling tote, no yard waste. Just a house, pale blue, sitting on a lawn that was green and mowed and perfect and absolutely, completely silent. And in the front window, someone was standing. Not a resident, not a mannequin, not one of the Cedar Hills watchers with their blank, patient gazes. This was Pam, from the office, standing in the front window of a house on a street that didn't exist yesterday, hands at her sides looking directly at Darren. She wasn't watching, she was waiting. Watching is passive. Waiting is anticipatory. Watching is what you do when you don't know what will happen. Waiting is what you do when you know exactly what will happen, and you are simply holding your position until it does. Darren stood on the sidewalk. Pam stood in the window. The moment held. Then Pam raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed. Not at Darren, past him, behind him, at the truck. Darren turned. The truck was idling at the curb. Marcus was in the cab. Tomas was standing by the hopper. Everything looked normal, except the route sheet. Darren could see it from where he stood, clipped to the dash, visible through the windshield. And even from 30 feet away, he could see that it was different. The paper was longer. It hung below the clip now, extending down the dash, covered in text that hadn't been there when the shift started. More streets, more addresses. The route had grown. He walked to the truck. He looked at the sheet. The original route, Riverside to Commercial Strip, Sycamore Circle, was at the top, unchanged. Below it, in the same typeface, was a new section. RO-TES, Extension, October 31, full coverage, all strets, all neighbor coverage, Dollar strets, all containers, 24 Hubbers Tatial, window, Creve 09 only, and below that, in smaller text, Darren Lott, Creve 09 only, and below that, in smaller text, Darren Lott, Marcus Ware, Thomas Reyes, confirmed, their names, confirmed, their names, printed. As if the route sheet had been generated with their participation already assumed. Marcus, Darren said, look at this. Marcus didn't look. Marcus was staring straight ahead, both hands on the wheel, and Darren realized that Marcus had already seen it, had seen it before Darren, had been sitting with it, processing it, filing it in whatever deep, private archive Marcus maintained for things the job included that he would never, under any circumstances, discuss. "It's Thursday," Marcus said. "We finish Thursday's route. We go home. We come back tomorrow for Friday, and then we come back Monday." "Marcus, it says October 31st. I know what day it is. It says all streets, all neighborhoods, 24 hours. What does that mean?" Marcus finally looked at him. And Marcus's face was not blank. Marcus's face was afraid. Not the sharp fear of an immediate threat. The deep, structural fear of a man who has understood something about his situation that he cannot understand, and who has been living with that understanding for a long time, carrying it like a weight in a bin that can never be emptied. "It means what it says," Marcus said. "October 31st, we drive every street in Hessler. We empty every container, every single one. And the rules." He stopped. Swallowed. "You saw what the Sycamore sheet said. No rules apply. But the rules are the only thing keeping. Tomas said the roads stretch. The bins are too heavy. The red tape bags. Marcus, the rules are containment. Without the rules." "Yeah. So on October 31st, we drive through the whole town with no containment. Yeah. Why?" Marcus put the truck in gear. He pulled away from Sycamore Circle. In the rearview mirror, the street was already less distinct. The houses fading, not like a mirage, not wavering or dissolving, but simply becoming less important to notice, sliding from perception the way a sound below the hearing threshold slides from awareness. By the time they reached the main road, Darren wasn't sure he could have pointed to where the turn had been. Marcus drove for 2 blocks in silence. Then, "Have you ever wondered why garbage collection exists?" What? Not the job. The concept. Why do humans gather their waste and put it at the curb and trust that someone will come take it away? Every house, every week, putting out the stuff they don't want, the stuff they've used up, the stuff that's done. And a truck comes, and it disappears. And nobody asks where it goes. It goes to the landfill. Some of it goes to the landfill. And the rest? Marcus turned onto the main road. The town of Hessler spread out ahead of them. Small and flat and ordinary, 9,000 people going about their Thursday, driving to work and dropping kids at school and buying groceries, and at the curb of every home and business, bins, thousands of bins, green and blue and brown, lined up along every street, waiting for collection, waiting to be emptied, waiting to give up what they held. "The rest goes where it's needed," Marcus said. "Hessler has had garbage collection since 1971. Consolidated Waste has had the contract since 1971. 54 years. Same company. Same roots. You think a town this size keeps a waste contractor for half a century without a single rebid? What are you telling me? I'm telling you the town didn't hire a garbage company. The garbage company built the town. Consolidated was here first. The houses came after. The people came after. The streets, Darren, the streets were laid out by Consolidated. The route map is the town map. You want to see the master route. You're driving on it. You're living in it. The master route is Hessler." They drove in silence for a long time after that. Darren sat in the passenger seat and looked at the town through the windshield and tried to see it the way Marcus was describing it. Not a town with a garbage service, but a garbage service with a town. A collection apparatus that had grown a human settlement around itself, the way a body grows around a vital organ, not for the organ's protection, but because the organ needed things to process. The houses were the bins. The people were the contents. And every week the truck came, and the route was maintained, and something was collected that was not trash. That night, Darren didn't go home. He drove to Mill Creek. Mill Creek was a seasonal drainage east of town, dry most of the year, a trickle in spring, occasionally a legitimate creek after heavy rains. It ran through a shallow ravine behind a row of dead orchards that hadn't produced anything in 20 years. Nobody went to Mill Creek. There was no reason to go to Mill Creek. The bin message had said, "The tanker goes to Mill Creek." Darren parked where the county road crossed the creek bed and walked downstream. The ravine was maybe 15 feet deep, steep-sided, choked with dry grass and scrub oak. The creek bed was sand and gravel and the occasional shopping cart. He walked for 10 minutes in the dark, using his phone's flashlight, the beam bouncing ahead of him off the pale sand. He found it at the half-mile mark, a concrete pad, industrial grade, 20 feet square, poured smooth, set into the creek bed like a foundation. At the center of the pad was a steel access hatch, a manhole cover essentially, but larger, maybe 4 feet in diameter, with a locking mechanism that had been recently oiled. The concrete around the hatch was stained with the same dark, iridescent liquid he'd seen dripping from the tanker's valve, and leading to the pad, pressed into the sand of the creek bed, were tire tracks. Tanker width. Recent. Darren stood on the pad. He put his foot on the hatch. He felt nothing. No pull, no warmth, no presence. The hatch was steel. The pad was concrete. The creek was dry. Everything was material and inert, and exactly what it appeared to be. He pulled the hatch. It opened easily, counterweighted, swinging up on a hinge with a pneumatic assist that hissed softly in the quiet ravine. Below the hatch was a shaft, concrete-lined, vertical, dropping into darkness. A steel ladder was bolted to one wall. The air that rose from the shaft was warm and smelled like nothing. Not nothing, as in odorless. Nothing, as in the absence of scent. A negative smell. The olfactory equivalent of silence. Darren climbed down. The shaft went deep. 30 feet. 40. The rungs were evenly spaced and dry, and his footsteps echoed off the concrete walls in a way that suggested the space below was large. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a tunnel. Horizontal, maybe 8 feet in diameter, lined with the same poured concrete, lit by industrial LED strips bolted to the ceiling every 10 feet. The light was white and even and institutional. The tunnel ran in one direction. Darren followed it. It went straight for maybe 200 yards, a gentle downward slope. The air warm and empty and still. The walls were clean. The floor was clean. There was no trash, no debris. No evidence of use except the lights themselves, which were on, which meant power, which meant someone maintained this. The tunnel ended at a room. The room was round, maybe 50 feet in diameter. The ceiling was domed, also concrete, also lit with LEDs. The floor was smooth and slightly concave, sloping toward the center like a shallow bowl. And at the center of the bowl, flush with the floor, was a drain. A standard industrial floor drain, 12 inches in diameter, stainless steel grate. Around the perimeter of the room, arranged in a circle, were objects. Darren walked closer. His footsteps were loud in the round space, reflecting off the dome and returning to him from every direction at once, so that each step sounded like several people walking. The objects were bins, garbage bins, standard 96-gallon residential bins, green with black lids, identical to the thousands of bins he handled every day on the route. There were, he counted, 53 of them, arranged in a perfect circle around the drain, evenly spaced, lids closed, upright, facing the center. Every bin had a strip of red tape around its lid, and every bin was vibrating. Not visibly. The bins weren't shaking, weren't moving, but the air around them was thick with a subsonic resonance, a frequency below hearing but above feeling, that made Darren's vision blur at the edges and his jaw ache, and the fillings in his teeth sing like tiny tuning forks. The vibration had a rhythm. It was slow, maybe one cycle every 4 or 5 seconds, and it was synchronized, all 53 bins pulsing together, like breathing, like a heartbeat, like the systolic and diastolic contraction of a single massive organ distributed across 53 separate containers, each one holding its portion of something that was, collectively, alive. Darren stood at the edge of the room. He did not walk to the center. He did not approach the bins. He did not touch anything. He looked at the drain. Through the steel grate, in the darkness below, something looked back. Not eyes. Nothing so anatomical. Nothing so datomical. Just attention. A dense, focused awareness rising through the drain like heat through a vent, pressing against the grate, registering his presence the way a tongue registers taste, automatically, chemically, without intent or effort. It knew he was there. It had always known he was there. It had known he was there since his first day on the route, since he'd picked up his first bin, since he'd entered the system that fed it. He was a capillary in a circulatory system he hadn't known he was part of, and the heart was here, in this room, distributed across 53 bins full of whatever the red tape contained, draining into whatever lived below the grate, nourished by a town that had been built, literally, physically, geographically built, to provide it with sustenance. Darren left. He climbed the ladder. He closed the hatch. He walked back to his car. He drove home. He went to bed. He set his alarm for 4:30 a.m. He did not quit. Not because of the money. Not anymore. The money had stopped being the reason somewhere around the second week, and he hadn't been honest enough with himself to acknowledge the switch. The real reason was simpler and worse. He was on the route sheet for October 31st. His name was printed, and he understood now with a clarity that felt less like a realization and more like a memory, as if he'd always known and the knowing had simply been scheduled for this moment, that the route sheet was not a request. The route sheet was a description. It described what would happen. It had described every route, every pickup, every red tape bag, an impossible bin, an empty street and window watcher, and every single thing it had described had come true. The route sheet was the most honest document in Hessler. It didn't predict the future. It was the future, printed and laminated and clipped to the visor of a truck that would drive the streets it named on the day it specified, because that was how Hessler worked. That was how it had always worked. The truck drove the route made the town, and the town fed the drain, and the drain fed the thing, and the ting grew. Darren didn't know what it was growing into. He didn't think anyone knew. Not Pam, not Marcus, not whoever had built the tunnel and poured the concrete and installed the LED lights. The thing under the grate had been there before the tunnel, before Consolidated, before Hessler. The infrastructure wasn't its cage. The infrastructure was its table setting, and on October 31st, for 24 hours, with no rules in effect and the entire town's containers open for collection, the thing would eat well. Friday, day 19. Overflow and special pickups. Darren worked the shift like any other. He lifted bins. He rode the step. He followed the rules. The sky was overcast, and the light was flat, and the town of Hessler looked exactly the way it had always looked. Small, ordinary, unremarkable in every way that mattered to anyone who didn't know what was under Mill Creek. At lunch, sitting in the cab while Marcus and Thomas ate outside, Darren opened the glove box. He was looking for napkins. What he found was a folder, manila, unlabeled, thin, maybe 5 pages inside. He opened it. The first page was a list of names, 47 names, in chronological order with dates next to each one. The dates spanned from 1971 to the present. Next to each name was a single word notation, ACT-IVE, transferret, or completed. Darren found his own name at the bottom. Asked I-5. He found Marcus. Asked I-5. He found Tomas. Asked I-5. He scanned upward. Most of the names were completed. A few were transferret. He didn't recognize any of them until he reached entry number 6, Dale Presswick, 1979 to 1982. Completed. Route Driver 6. Check what happened to Route Driver 6. The second page was a single paragraph, typed, undated. Route Driver 6. Presswick, D., was the first to locate the Mill Creek facility without guidance. He attempted to remove the red-sealed containers. The containers were not removable. Presswick escalated to physical breach of one container. Contents of container made brief contact with Presswick's hands and forearms. Presswick completed the October 31st full coverage route that year without incident. He did not report to work on November 1st. His residence at 414 Orchard Park was found empty. A single green container was at the curb. The container was sealed with red tape and was collected on the next scheduled pickup. Presswick was classified as completed. Darren read it twice. Then he turned to the third page. It was a map, a street map of Hessler, printed at a scale that fit the full town on one page. Every street was there: Maple Terrace, Cedar Hills, Pemberton Lane, Orchard Park, the Flats, Riverside, and Sycamore Circle, drawn in as a recent addition, its curve visible at the south edge of town. But the map had an overlay, a second set of lines drawn in red ink, connecting specific addresses across the town. Not streets, addresses. Individual houses linked by red lines that cut across blocks and through lots and ignored the street grid entirely, forming a pattern that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with something else, some other logic, some other organizing principle. When Darren looked at the pattern, he felt the same subsonic vibration he'd felt in the room under Mill Creek, faint, distant, but present, as if the map was a two-dimensional representation of the thing's circulatory system, and looking at it was enough to activate a sympathetic resonance, the way hearing a heartbeat can sync your own pulse to its rhythm. The red lines connected 47 addresses, the same number as the names on the list. The last red line ran from one Sycamore Circle to the Mill Creek facility, and the address linked to Darren's name, the address at the other end of his red line, was his apartment. The one-bedroom unit above Gloria and her wheel of fortune, his home. He was part of the circuit. He had been since day one. His presence on the route wasn't employment. It was infrastructure. He was a segment of the collection system, a stretch of pipe between the surface and the drain, and on October 31st, when the rules came down and the route went full coverage and the bins opened, his segment would carry whatever needed carrying, and the only question was whether he'd be the pipe or the contents. Darren closed the folder. He put it back in the glove box. He finished a shift. Saturday and Sunday passed. Darren stayed in his apartment. He didn't drive to Mill Creek. He didn't drive past the Consolidated building. He didn't call anyone or tell anyone or do anything at all except sit in his kitchen and eat cereal and watch his hands for signs of change. He watched because of Presswick. Contents of container made brief contact with Presswick's hands and forearms, and then Presswick had finished the October 31st route, and then Presswick had vanished, and then a sealed bin was at his curb. Darren hadn't touched the contents. He'd stood in the room. He'd breathed the air. He'd been seen through the drain. Was that enough? He looked at his hands. They were his hands, calloused from work. A small scar on the left thumb from a box cutter in high school. Normal human hands. He looked at his hands, and they were normal, and he put them down, and he picked up his cereal spoon, and he thought, I could leave, right now, pack a bag and drive to Sacramento, and get on I-5 and go north until Hessler's a memory. I could do that. He didn't do it. He didn't do it because the route sheet had his name on it, and the route sheet was the truth. And if the route sheet said he'd be in the truck on October 31st, then he'd be in the truck on October 31st, not because he was compelled, not because he was controlled. Because in Hessler, what the sheet described happened. That was the rule beneath the rules. That was the foundation the whole system rested on. The town was the route, and the route was the sheet, and the sheet was the future. And the future was fixed. He could feel the fixedness of it, like standing on train tracks and feeling the rail hum before the train is visible. Something was coming. Something was on schedule. And Darren was on the route. Monday, October 27th, 4 days out, the route was normal. Maple Terrace, Cedar Hills, Pemberton. The watchers were in the windows. The bins were at the curbs. Darren worked mechanically, his body in the rhythm while his mind worked the problem. He wanted information. Specifically, he wanted to know what the full coverage route looked like. The October 31st sheet had said all streets, all neighborhoods, all containers. That was the entire town. Every house, every bin, every red tape bag. collected in a single 24-hour window by a single 3-person crew. That was physically impossible. The regular weekly route, 1/5 of the town per day, took a full shift. Collecting everything in one day, even a 24-hour day, would require a speed that no truck and no crew could sustain, unless the town got smaller. Unless, on October 31st, with no rules in effect, the streets contracted the way Tomas said they expanded. The roads behaved when they were being watched. What if, for one day, nothing was watching? What if every street in Hessler folded inward, compressed, tightened like a fist, until the whole town was a single route, a single loop, and the truck could drive it in one continuous circuit? What if October 31st was the one day the town stopped pretending to be a town and became what it actually was, a collection system, a funnel, a drain? On Cedar Hills, at 4412, the woman was in the window. Same position, same gaze. Hands at her sides. Darren stopped. He stood on the sidewalk and he looked at her and she looked at him. Rule 3 said, don't speak to them. But Rule 3 was a containment rule, and containment was ending in 4 days, and Darren was tired of being managed. Do you know what's coming? He asked. His voice was clear in the morning air. October 31st. Do you know? The woman didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react. Then she raised one hand. She pressed it flat against the window glass, and she tilted her head, slowly, wrong, in a way that human necks are not designed to accommodate, the angle too sharp and the motion too smooth, as if the joint was a bearing rather than a bone, and she smiled. The smile was wrong too wide, too symmetrical. And inside the smile, behind the teeth, there was darkness. Not the darkness of a mouth, the darkness of a space, a cavity, a volume where a throat should be and wasn't, replaced by something deep and open and waiting. Darren took a step back. The woman's other hand came up, pressed against the glass, both palms flat. The glass fogged around her fingers, not from warmth, but from presence. The glass registering the pressure of something that was more here than normal matter, something dense and real and very, very attentive. She was not a person. She had never been a person. The watchers on Cedar Hills were not residents observing the garbage truck. They were the garbage observing the truck. They were the contents, manifested standing in the windows of the bins that housed them, watching the route that fed them, waiting for the day the lids came off. Darren walked back to the truck. He did not run. He got on the step. He hit the side twice, the signal to proceed, and Marcus pulled forward. You talked to one, Tomas said from the other side of the truck. Not angry, not scared, exhausted. You shouldn't have talked to one. What are they? I don't know. You've been here 4 years. You must. I don't know what they are. I know what they do. They watch. They wait. They count the trucks, and they count the days, and on October 31st, Tomas stopped. He closed his eyes. He pressed his hand to his sternum like something was pushing from inside. They what, Tomas? They come to the curb. And that was all Tomas would say. Tuesday. 3 days. Darren did something he hadn't done since taking the job. He went to the public library. Hessler's library was a converted ranch house on Crest Avenue, staffed by 2 women who both appeared to be in their 70s, and who both wore reading glasses on beaded chains. The local history section was a single shelf. He found what he was looking for in 20 minutes. Hessler had been incorporated in 1971. Before that, the area was unincorporated county land orchards, cattle grazing, the occasional farmstead. The town's founding documents, preserved in a bound volume with a cracked spine, listed the original petitioners for incorporation. 7 names. The first was Charles Consolidated, listed as Proprietor, Consolidated Waste Services. The town had been founded by the garbage company, not contracted with it later. Founded by it, the company came first. Then the streets, then the houses, then the people. Just like Marcus said, Darren pulled the county land records for the Mill Creek area. Before 1971, the parcel was listed as unimproved, no structures. After 1971, it was listed as utility easement, consolidated waste services, perpetual access, subsurface rights, the right to what was beneath the ground. Granted in perpetuity, he pulled the census records. Hessler's population in 1972, 340. In 1980, 1,200. In 1990, 3,800. In 1990, 3,800. In 2000, 6,100. In 2010, 7,900. In 2020, 8,900. Steady growth every decade for 50 years. Never a decline, never a plateau. As if the population was being dosed, increased in measured increments, each one slightly larger than the last, each one adding more houses and more bins and more contents to the collection system. And on the census form for each decade, in the section listing the town's commercial services, the same entry, waste collection, consolidated waste services. Sale provider. No competitive bids. Contract. Perpetual. Darren closed the book. He sat at the library table and looked at the spines of the other books on the local history shelf and thought about what it meant to live in a town that was, in the most literal sense, built as a feeding apparatus. The streets were digestive tracts, the houses were stomachs. The bins were the interface between the human world and whatever lived beneath Mill Creek. The point of exchange where the waste of 9,000 lives was collected and processed and converted into something that could pass through a 12-inch drain and nourish a thing that had been waiting in the earth since before the orchards, before the cattle, before the first human boot pressed into the soil of this valley. And every October 31st, every year, for 54 years, the system ran at full capacity. One day. All containers. No rules. The annual harvest. Wednesday, 2 days. The flats. South Harmon was different. Darren felt it the moment the truck turned onto the street. The houses looked the same. The bins were at the curbs. The sky was the same, flat gray. But the air was heavier. Denser. The subsonic vibration he'd felt in the Mill Creek room was here now, distributed through the atmosphere. So faint it was less a feeling than an alteration in the quality of reality itself, as if someone had turned up the resolution of the world by a single increment, made everything fractionally sharper and more present and more actual. The bins were humming, not individually, collectively. A single low tone shared across every container on the street, a chord made up of hundreds of components, each one contributing its frequency to a harmony that was. Darren had to stop walking when he heard it, when it stopped being something he felt in his jaw and became something he heard with his actual ears. For the first time, beautiful. It was beautiful, the way deep water is beautiful from a cliff. Beautiful and vast, and completely indifferent to whether you survived the experience of its beauty. It's starting early this year, Tomas said. He was standing on the curb, not touching the bin in front of him, just standing. Listening. His eyes were closed. The humming. It usually starts the day before. The 30th. Not the 29th. What does that mean? It means it's hungry. Marcus called from the cab. We're not collecting South Harmon today. It's on the sheet, Darren said. Check the sheet, Darren shagged. South Harmon was not on the sheet. It had been on the sheet at the start of the shift. He was certain. Absolutely certain, the way he'd been certain that Pemberton was a Monday street, the certainty that the route sheet routinely and quietly overrode. South Harmon was now listed under October 31st. 2 days early, it had been pulled from the regular rotation and reserved for the full coverage run. The street was pre-staging. Its bins were already full of whatever the red tape contained, already humming, already sinking to the rhythm of the thing beneath Mill Creek. The harvest was assembling itself. They skipped South Harmon. They finished the flats. They went home. Darren sat in his apartment and listened to Gloria watch Wheel of Fortune and thought about the fact that in 2 days he was going to drive every street in Hessler with no rules, no containment, no boundary between himself and a system that had been eating for 54 years. He thought about leaving. He thought about Sacramento and I-5 and the simple mechanical act of turning a key and pressing a pedal and watching Hessler shrink in the rearview mirror. And then he thought about the route sheet, his name. Printed. Confirm it. Could you outrun a document that described the future? Could you contradict a piece of paper that had never been wrong? He didn't know. And the not knowing was enough to keep him in his apartment, in his bed, alarm set for 4:30, boots by the door. Thursday, October 30th, one day. There was no route. Darren showed up at 4:45. Marcus was there. Tomas was there. The truck was there. But the route sheet was blank except for a single line, October 30, standby, October 31, 12 a.m. They had the day off, an entire day to sit with what was coming. What do you do on your day before? Darren asked Tomas in the parking lot. Tomas was leaning against the building, thermos in hand, looking at the sky like a farmer reading weather. I call my sister in Modesto. I eat something good. I go to bed early. This is your fifth one. Your fifth October 31st. Fourth. My first year I was too new. They don't put you on the full coverage until your second year. But they put me on it. First year. Tomas looked at him. The look was complicated. Sympathy, curiosity, something else. Yeah, Tomas said. They did? Why? Probably because you went to Mill Creek. Nobody goes to Mill Creek their first month. Most people never go. I've never been. Marcus has never been. You've never seen what's down there? I know what's down there. Everybody on the crew knows what's down there. You don't have to see it to know. But I saw it, and it saw you. And now your red line goes straight to the facility instead of to the network. You're direct. You're a direct line. What does that mean for tomorrow? Tomas poured the last of his coffee on the ground. The liquid hit the asphalt, and Darren watched it spread. And for an instant, just a flicker, the coffee moved toward the drain at the edge of the parking lot, not following gravity, not following the slope, moving with intent, seeking the drain. Then it was just coffee on asphalt. Normal. It means you'll be the one opening the bins, Tomas said. And he got in his car and drove away. Darren spent October 30th driving. Not to leave. To understand. He drove every street in Hessler, slowly, methodically, the way he drove the route. And he looked at the town the way Marcus had described it. Not as a place where people lived, but as a system through which something flowed. The streets made more sense this way. The layout, which had always seemed like standard suburban sprawl, revealed an underlying structure when you stopped looking for human logic and started looking for hydraulic logic. The streets didn't connect neighborhoods to amenities. They connected higher ground to lower ground. Every road in Hessler, no matter how it curved or branched, ultimately trended downhill, toward the east, toward Mill Creek. The town was a watershed, a drainage basin. And on the surface, for 364 days a year, it drained rainwater and runoff like any other piece of developed land. But on October 31st, with no rules and every bin open, it drained something else. Darren drove past his own apartment. He looked at the building from the street and tried to see it the way the thing under Mill Creek saw it. Not as a building, but as a node, a point on the network, a container. His apartment was a bin, and he was what was inside it. And tomorrow the truck would come, and the lid would open, and the contents would be collected. He drove home. He ate a sandwich. He went to bed. He set his alarm for 11:30 p.m. October 31st. Darren pulled into the consolidated parking lot at 11:55 p.m. The sodium lights were on. The trucks were lined up. Unit 09 was at the front, engine already running, headlights on. Marcus was in the cab. Tomas was on the step. The truck looked different. The same truck, same Mac LR, same unit number stenciled on the door, but different. The compactor housing had been removed. The entire rear section of the truck was an open hopper, A steel box with no lid and no compaction mechanism, just a space, a receptacle. And the hopper was deep, deeper than the truck's physical dimensions should allow. Darren looked into it, and the bottom was not visible. Not dark, not hidden by shadow. Just up there. The hopper extended down, and it did not end. The route sheet was on the dash. Darren climbed into the cab and read it. Every street in Hessler was listed, every address. But the addresses were not in geographical order. They were not in any order Darren recognized. The sequence moved erratically across the town. Cedar Hills to the Flats, to Orchard Park, to Riverside, jumping between neighborhoods with no logical path. Then he saw it. The addresses were in order of elevation, starting at the highest point in Hessler and descending, address by address, toward the lowest, toward Mill Creek. The route was a drain. The truck was going to flow downhill through the town like water, collecting as it went, and when it reached the bottom, the Mill Creek facility, the hopper would empty into the shaft, into the tunnel, into the room with 53 bins, into the drain and the floor, into the thing that waited beneath. Midnight, Marcus said. He put the truck in gear. They drove. The first street was Ridgeview Terrace, the highest elevation in Hessler. A short cul-de-sac with 6 houses that Darren had never serviced because it wasn't on the regular route. The houses were dark. The bins were at the curb. Darren got out. He walked to the first bin. He opened the lid. It was full of the dark liquid, the same iridescent fluid from the tanker, from the valve, from the stains on the Mill Creek concrete. The bin was a 96-gallon container filled to the brim with a substance that shifted from green to purple to the color with no name and the white of the truck's headlights. Darren tipped the bin into the hopper. The liquid poured in, thick, slow, viscous, and hit the bottom of the bottomless hopper and was gone. Not splashing, not pooling, absorbed, taken. The second bin was the same, and the third. Every bin on Ridgeview Terrace was full of it, and as Darren emptied them, one by one, the hum started. The same chord from South Harmon, from Mill Creek, from the red tape bags and the heavy bins and the window watchers, but louder now and closer and resonant with something that felt like gratitude. The truck moved downhill. The next street, the next bins, more fluid, more emptying. The hopper took everything and gave nothing back. On Cedar Hills, the windows were empty. No watchers. For the first time, the windows were dark and the houses were still, and nobody stood at the glass with their hands at their sides. They were already at the curb. They were already in the bins. The watchers had been the contents all along, and now the lids were off and the contents were flowing. Darren opened bin after bin. His hands were wet with the liquid. It was warm. It clung to his skin. It didn't burn, didn't itch, didn't do anything except be there, present, real, more here than his own skin. Where the fluid touched him, his body felt, thin, permeable, as if the boundary between himself and the air was negotiable. "Don't stop," Marcus said from the cab. "Keep the pace. What happens if I stop? The route is a drain. If you stop the flow, it backs up. If it backs up, the streets stretch. The streets dissolve. The whole town loses cohesion. There's nothing holding Hessler together except the route. The route is the structure. If the route stops, the structure fails, and 9,000 people wake up in a place that doesn't have streets or addresses or walls." Darren kept moving. Bin after bin, street after street. The hum grew louder. The fluid grew thicker. The hopper swallowed everything. The truck rolled downhill through the town like a clot through a vein, slow and deliberate, collecting the blood of whatever vast organism Hessler had been built to nourish. Hours passed. Darren lost count of the bins. His arms were coated to the elbows. The fluid was warm and it moved on its own now, not dripping from his arms but circulating, flowing up from his wrists to his shoulders and back down, as if his circulatory system had become an extension of the things, a capillary connected to the great vascular network of the town. Tomas worked the other side of the street. He was quiet. His arms were the same, wet, glistening, the fluid tracing his veins like an externalized bloodstream. He didn't complain, he didn't speak, he worked. This was his fourth harvest. He knew the rhythm. At some point, 30 a.m. maybe, or 4 OL, the time had become unreliable. Darren realized the houses were gone, not destroyed, not vanished, simplified. The houses had lost their distinguishing features. No more beige or green or blue. No more ceramic frogs or pelicans or bird baths. No more garages or fences or mailboxes. Just structures, rectangular, uniform, identical. Each one a box with a bin in front of it, and each bin full of the dark fluid and the truck moving between them like a needle drawing blood. The town had stopped pretending. For one night, for 24 hours, Hessler was what it was, a collection apparatus, a grid of containers, a farm. By 6 a.m., they were in the low streets. The flats, South Harmon. The gradient was steeper here, the truck moving faster, the bins coming quicker. Darren's body was automatic, reach, lift, pour, replace. The fluid coated him fully now. His clothes were saturated. His hair was wet with it. The line between his skin and the fluid had blurred to the point where he couldn't tell where he ended and it began. And the terrible thing was that it didn't feel terrible. It felt efficient, right, like a tool being used for its designed purpose, like a pipe carrying water. At 7 a.m., South Harmon ended. The route sheet had one entry left, Mill Screet Facility, Final Creek Facility, Filed, Discharge, all contents. Marcus drove the truck to the county road, down the creek bed. The tanker tracks led the way. The concrete pad was ahead, the hatch already open, the shaft lit from below. The truck backed up to the edge of the pad. Marcus engaged the hydraulic tilt. The hopper angled. The fluid, all of it, the entire night's collection, the liquefied essence of whatever the bins contained, whatever the watchers had been, whatever the town produced in the dark of its annual giving, poured into the shaft. A river of dark iridescence falling into the earth. The sound it made was not a splash. It was a chord. The same chord. The hum. But resolved now, complete. Every note in its place. Every frequency accounted for. A harmony so total it sounded like silence. Darren stood at the edge of the shaft and looked down. The fluid fell and was received. And from the depths, rising through the column of descending liquid like a voice through a waterfall, the attention pressed back. The thing was looking up at him. The thing was fed and full. And what it felt, if it felt, was something Darren had no word for but recognized anyway. The way a ground recognizes rain, the way a root recognizes water, something below thought, something older than hunger, something that would be here long after Hessler was dust and the last bin had crumbled and the last truck had rusted into nothing. The hopper emptied. The shaft swallowed the last of the fluid. The hum faded to its usual subsonic murmur. The hatch stayed open. It would close on its own. Darren knew when it was ready. Everything in the system operated on its own schedule. Marcus drove the truck back to the consolidated lot. He parked it. He turned off the engine. They sat in the cab as the sun came up. November 1st, 7:42 a.m. The sky clear for the first time in weeks. Blue and sharp and specific, in a way that felt like an overcorrection, as if the atmosphere was trying too hard to be normal. Darren looked at his hands. The fluid was gone. His skin was clean. His clothes were dry. There was no trace of the night's work on his body. But his hands felt different. Not wrong, not damaged, just thinner, less dense. As if a layer had been removed, a coating he'd never known he had. And what was left was closer to the surface, more exposed, more available to whatever might want to reach through. Same time Monday, Marcus said. Regular route. Yeah. Darren, yeah. Don't go back to Mill Creek. The off-season, it sleeps. Let it sleep. Okay. And next October, when the sheet comes down with the full coverage schedule, don't read ahead. It's easier if you don't read ahead. Darren nodded. He got out of the truck. He walked to his car. He drove home. He showered. He ate cereal. He sat on his bed and listened to Glory's television through the floor and looked at his hands and tried to remember what they'd felt like before. He couldn't. Monday, November 3rd. Regular route. Darren showed up at 4:45. Marcus was there. Tomas was there. The truck, Unit 09, compactor reinstalled, hopper restored to normal depth, was there. The route sheet was on the dash. Maple Terrace, Cedar Hills, Pemberton Lane. They drove. They collected. Bins at the curb. Normal weight, normal contents, coffee grounds and junk mail and banana peels. The mundane waste of human lives, flowing into the truck, flowing to the landfill, the actual landfill this time, the county facility on Route 12, where garbage went to be garbage. On Cedar Hills, the watchers were back. 44-112, the woman in the window. 44-18, the man. 44-24, the woman. 44-30, the teenager, hands at their sides, watching, but the quality of the watching had changed. Before October 31st, the watchers had been expectant, anticipating, building toward, oriented toward the future. Now they were satisfied, settled. Their attention was the attention of a creature that had been fed, that was resting, that was beginning already, the long, slow accumulation toward the next October. Darren didn't look at them. He worked the bins. He rode the step. He followed the rules. Rule 1, Rule 2, Rule 3, Rule 4, Rule 5, Rule 6. The rules were back. The containment was restored. The world was behaving because it was being watched, and the truck was watching it, and the route was the structure, and the structure held. Darren thought about Presswick. Route Driver 6. Completed. A man who had touched what was inside the bins and had, within 24 hours, become what was inside the bins. Darren had been coated in the fluid, soaked in it, for hours. He looked at his hands. They were his hands. Calloused, scarred, thin. He curled his fingers. They responded. He pressed his thumb to each fingertip, index, middle, ring, pinky, all present, all accounted for. But when he pressed his thumb to his ring finger, he felt, briefly, faintly, like a radio station tuned just below audibility. The hum. It was in him now. A trace, a seed, a filament of the thing beneath Mill Creek, threaded through his nervous system like a wire through a wall, carrying no current yet, but present, installed, ready. He had a year. 11 months and 27 days until the next October 31st. 11 months and 27 days during which the filament would grow, during which his hands would thin further and his skin would become more permeable, and the boundary between Darren Lott and the collection system would erode the way a pipe erodes from the inside, slowly, invisibly, until one day the pipe is more flow than metal, more current in a container, and the distinction between the thing that carries and the thing that is carried ceases to exist. He would be on the route sheet next October. His name would be printed. Confirmed. And the year after that. And the year after that, until the word next to his name changed from AC-Tive to completed, and a green bin sealed with red tape appeared at the curb of his apartment, and the truck came, and the route continued. That afternoon, off the clock, Darren drove past the intersection where Sycamore Circle had been. The street was gone. The turn was gone. The asphalt and the houses and the street sign, gone. Just empty land, drainage easement, dry grass. But in the dirt at the shoulder of the road, there was a fresh green street sign lying face down, as if it had been removed and discarded. Darren pulled over. He picked it up. Sycamore Circle. On the back, in the same black marker as the bin messages, in the same small, neat handwriting. See you next year, Darwin. He put the sign down. He drove home. He went to bed. The route sheet was already being printed for tomorrow.